Chapter 9. The Weight of Ash. The military transport rattled over rough terrain, carrying us 40 miles from the academy into the scarred territories. I sat beside two other binders from Dane's rotation, both of them more experienced, both watching the landscape pass with practiced indifference. This was routine for them. A milk run, locate a chaos pocket, assess threat level, seal it if possible, or mark it for specialists if not. Standard protocol for advanced students approaching graduation. For me, it was my first real mission. The scarred territories stretched in every direction, a landscape that had been dying slowly for 150 years. Grass grew in patches of normal green and wrong purple. Trees twisted at angles that defied physics. In the distance, a forest of crystallized wood caught the morning light, creating rainbow refractions that hurt to look at directly. Dane sat at the front of the transport with the other cleaver, a third year named Garrett who carried himself with confident competence. They discussed approach strategies in low voices, planning for contingencies that probably wouldn't matter. This was supposed to be simple. The chaos pocket came into view an hour later, and simple died immediately. It wasn't small. It was a writhing sphere of corruption 50 feet in diameter, suspended 5 feet above the ground like a grotesque sun. Energy pulsed from its surface in waves that made reality buckle and warp. The air around it shimmered with heat distortion that had nothing to do with temperature.
"That's not a pocket,"
one of the binders whispered.
"That's a manifestation site."
Dane was already moving, sliding from the transport before it fully stopped. His hand went to Culmination's hilt, the great sword humming with contained power at his touch.
"Assessment,"
he commanded, his voice cutting through the rising tension. Garrett approached cautiously, his own blade drawn.
"It's unstable, pulsing at irregular intervals. This is beyond our mission parameters."
"Agreed."
Dane's crystalline eyes tracked the sphere's rotation, calculating.
"We need to report back and request a specialist team."
The pocket pulsed. Reality folded in on itself with a sound like tearing fabric. The sphere expanded suddenly, doubling in size, and then it ruptured. Chaos energy exploded outward in a wave of corruption that hit like physical force. I felt it wash over me, tasting of copper and rotting flowers, that familiar wrongness that tried to unmake everything it touched. Then the creatures came. They poured from the ruptured sphere in a flood of impossible shapes. Things with too many limbs that bent at angles that shouldn't exist. Monsters that phased in and out of reality, visible one moment, gone the next, attacking from directions that had no name. Horrors that had been animals once, or people, or something worse. Their forms twisted into configurations that hurt to perceive.
"Defensive positions,"
Dane roared. We scattered, falling into formation without conscious thought. The training drilled into us, taking over, bodies moving before our minds caught up. Dane moved like death itself. Culmination carved through impossible flesh with strikes that left silver wounds hanging in the air. Each cut was precise, mathematical, severing creatures along lines that separated existence from void. The monsters didn't bleed. They simply ceased. Reality rejecting their wrongness the moment order touched chaos. But there were too many of them. For every creature Dane killed, 2 more poured from the ruptured sphere. They came in waves, each more wrong than the last. Things that screamed with voices that predated language. Things that moved through angles that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. Garrett handled his section with adequate competence. cutting down creatures with solid technique, but he was being pushed back. One of the other binders was bleeding from a gash across her shoulder, where something with too many claws had gotten through her shield. The other binder wove support frantically, shields deflecting attacks, amplification making the cleaver's strikes more devastating, binding nets immobilizing faster creatures long enough for killing blows. It wasn't enough. A creature phased into existence beside me, all teeth and hunger and geometries that hurt to perceive. I had barely enough time to throw up a desperate barrier before it struck. The shield held for 3 seconds before shattering, the feedback sending me stumbling backward. My foot came down on something sharp. Pain lanced through my heel, sudden and bright. I looked down and saw a shard of corrupted crystal jutting from the ground, my boot torn open, blood welling dark against leather. I didn't have time to process it. Another creature was coming. I wove a binding net with hands that shook, catching the thing mid-leap. It thrashed in the rainbow threads, reality warping around its wrongness. Dane was there a heartbeat later, culmination severing the creature through the point where my net held it immobilized. The thing ceased.
You're hurt.
Dane said, his eyes flicking to my bloodied boot. I'm functional. I limped sideways, trying to ignore the grinding pain in my heel. Left flank, 3 more coming. He moved without question, trusting my assessment. I fell into rhythm without thinking. My hands wove patterns in the air, rainbow threads connecting to Dane's channeling. I could feel when he needed amplification before he called for it, could sense the shape his next strike would take, and weave support into it without disrupting his flow. The synchronization was instinctive, natural. When he moved left, I was already weaving barriers to cover his blind side. When he prepared a heavy strike, I amplified his channeling without being asked. When a creature tried to phase behind him, I had a binding net deployed before conscious thought registered the threat. We moved like parts of one weapon. Then pain lanced through my foot as the crystal shard pierced deep, and I gasped despite myself. Dane's head snapped toward me mid-strike. His offhand moved in a sharp gesture, silver light flashing across the distance between us. The pain vanished, not dulled, not reduced. Simply gone, severed from my awareness like it had never existed. My foot still bled, the injury still real, but the agony that should have crippled me was absent. He had cast while fighting, splitting his attention without breaking rhythm, protecting me without conscious thought. I didn't have time to process it. Another wave of creatures surged forward, minutes blurred into desperate motion. I wove support, barriers, amplification, binding nets. My foot left blood trails on the corrupted earth, the wound worsening with each step I couldn't feel. Then a creature burst from the ground beneath Dane, all teeth and barbed tentacles. It wrapped around his leg before he could dodge, barbs piercing through armor into flesh. My hands were already moving. Rainbow threads wove through the air between my other castings, slipping past his defenses, binding torn muscle back together. The healing magic was subtle, threaded between amplifications and barriers so seamlessly that Dane might not have even noticed. He grunted but didn't cry out. Culmination carved through the creature in a silver arc, dissolving it into component chaos. His leg was whole again. Healed. But I could see the slight hitch in his movements, the way he favored it despite the tissue being intact. The pain remained. I had fixed the structure but couldn't touch the neural memory of injury. We kept fighting. Our synchronization deepened with each exchange. I stopped thinking about individual spells and simply wove what was needed. Barriers appeared where attacks would land. Amplification flowed when he prepared to strike. Binding nets caught creatures in perfect positions for his killing blows. And between everything, I wove healing into his injuries while he severed my pain with casual precision. Dane's channeling became an extension of my awareness. I could feel the shape of his cleaving magic, sense when he was about to move, anticipate his needs before he recognized them himself. We were fighting for our lives, and somewhere in the desperate synchronization, we had stopped being two separate mages and become something unified. The last creature fell with a sound like tearing fabric, its body unraveling into component chaos that dissipated harmlessly. Silence crashed over the battlefield. Dane limped toward me, his leg whole and healed, but clearly still sore from the pain I couldn't eliminate. Blood soaked through my boot, the wound I couldn't feel still bleeding freely. We reached each other at the same moment, both assessing damage with professional efficiency.
Your foot.
Dane said, his eyes tracking the blood trail I had left. Your leg, I countered. He gestured sharply, silver light flashing as he severed his own pain. The relief was visible in his posture, the slight hitch in his gait disappearing as neural signals were cut away from his awareness. I knelt and began weaving healing threads around my foot, binding torn tissue back together, closing the wound that had been bleeding throughout the entire fight.
How bad?
Dane asked, kneeling beside me. Bad enough. Went clean through. I focused on the weaving, rainbow threads stitching flesh to flesh with precise control.
Let me see.
I looked up, about to protest that I was already handling it, when movement exploded from the corrupted earth. A creature burst upward between us, smaller than the others but faster, its form flickering between states of existence. All teeth and malice and desperate hunger. Dane's hand moved. My hands moved. Silver light and rainbow threads struck simultaneously, our magic weaving together without plan or discussion. His cleaving severed the creature along impossible lines, while my binding held those severed pieces in stasis, preventing them from reforming or dissolving. The thing hung suspended for a heartbeat, caught between existence and void, held in the perfect synchronization of our combined magic. Then it shattered into harmless dust. We stared at each other, both breathing hard, the echo of perfect resonance still humming between us.
The pocket's core is collapsing.
Garrett's voice shattered the moment.
We need to seal it now or retreat before it births something worse. Silence crashed over the battlefield.
Garrett and the other binders were checking their own injuries, calling status reports. One binder down but stable. Multiple lacerations. No one critically wounded. He glanced at me, something I didn't recognize flashing across his face before training reasserted control. The pocket's core was collapsing inward, the ruptured sphere trying to detonate itself or birth something worse. Energy built in visible waves, reality protesting the concentration of chaos. Dane made a decision.
We seal it now,
He called over the sounds of combat.
before it explodes or manifests something we can't kill.
That requires convergence casting.
Garrett said, cutting through another creature.
Complex work. Risky.
I know what it requires.
Dane's voice carried absolute certainty. He looked past the more experienced binder, past Garrett's obvious competence, directly at me.
Harrow, you're with me.
My stomach dropped. What?
You're with me.
He repeated, No explanation. Just certainty. The other binder's expression flickered with offense before professional neutrality reasserted itself. She moved to support Garrett without comment, covering the perimeter while Dane and I approached the collapsing pocket. The sphere's surface roiled with colors that had no names, geometries that existed in more dimensions than 3. Standing this close made my teeth ache, made the ink in my system resonate with sympathetic chaos.
Chaos purge.
Dane said, his voice low and controlled.
You know the theory?
Yes, I had memorized it weeks ago, studied the complex mathematics of combining cleaving severance with binding stabilization to purge chaos from reality itself.
Theory is easy. Execution requires perfect synchronization. If our timing is off by even a second, this thing explodes and takes us with it.
Understood.
Then, let's begin.
He planted culmination in the ground before the sphere, silver light erupting along the blade's length. The cleaving magic carved a boundary line through reality, defining where order ended and chaos began. I wove threads that connected to his channeling, amplifying and directing the flow. The binding magic wrapped around his severance, containing it, shaping it, preparing to weave stability into whatever void his cutting created. The resonance hit immediately. Not just our magic synchronizing, something deeper. I could sense his intent before he channeled, feel the shape his cleaving would take and weave my binding to match. Our magics didn't just complement, they harmonized, creating something neither of us could achieve alone. The chaos purge built between us, silver and rainbow light merging into patterns that made the air shimmer. Dane drove his blade deeper into the boundary, severing the pocket's connection to reality. I wove stability into the wound he created, binding clean order where chaos had been. The sphere began to collapse inward, pulled by our combined magic. It fought. Chaos always fought. The energy bucked and writhed, trying to escape the net we were weaving around it. But our synchronization was perfect, our timing flawless. The pocket compressed smaller, until it was just a fist-sized sphere of writhing darkness contained in a cage of silver rainbow light. Dane cut through it with one final strike. The sphere exploded into nothingness, and the sudden release of contained energy created a spatial distortion. Reality folded in on itself with a sound like shattering glass. I felt the world lurch. One moment, Dane and I stood at the pocket's epicenter, the ground solid beneath our feet, our team visible 20 yards away. The next moment, I was stumbling onto sun-baked earth, my stomach churning with violent displacement, visions swimming as my inner ear tried to reconcile the impossible distance we had just crossed. Teleportation, violent and disorienting and wrong in ways that made me want to vomit. Dane caught my elbow, steadying us both. His grip was firm, grounding me while the world spun.
Breathe.
He commanded.
Slowly. The disorientation will pass.
I forced air into my lungs, counted breaths until the nausea subsided enough to stand without support. When my vision cleared, I looked around. The scarred territories stretched in every direction, but wrong. The landscape was subtly different, flatter, more desolate. And our team was nowhere in sight. Where are we? My voice sounded distant, strained.
About 100 miles from where we started.
Dane released my arm, scanning the horizon with practiced efficiency.
Spatial distortion. Rare but not unheard of when sealing large manifestations. The energy has to go somewhere. Usually it dissipates. Sometimes it displaces.
The others?
Still at the original site, probably wondering where we went.
He frowned, calculating.
We need to reach the nearest outpost and report our position.
Then I felt it. The ashen ink buildup was severe. The convergence casting had flooded our systems with byproduct, and the spatial trauma had made it worse. The ink pressed against the inside of my skull like water behind a dam, emotions swinging wildly between euphoria and despair. Black marks were spreading up my arms in branching patterns, visible even through my uniform sleeves. Dane's condition was worse. Silver sheen coated his shoulders and neck, visible as a metallic dust that caught the light. His hands trembled slightly, fingers twitching with crystallization beginning at the joints. We needed transfer. Immediately. Dane's jaw tightened as he assessed the situation, his crystalline eyes tracking the same symptoms I was feeling.
We're about 10 miles from the nearest outpost town. Can you walk? Yes.
The word came out more confident than I felt. He took my hand without ceremony. The transfer began immediately, flowing between our clasped palms. His cold order soothing my volatile chaos, my wild energy loosening his rigid control. The exchange was familiar now, mechanical from weeks of scheduled sessions. But it wasn't enough. A simple hand clasp couldn't handle this much accumulated byproduct. The ink continued building despite the transfer, pressure growing instead of releasing. The ash kept spreading across Dane's skin, silver creeping toward his elbows. We started walking, hands still clasped, hoping the continued contact would accelerate the exchange. My feet hurt. The thought was distant, almost trivial compared to the magic threatening to fragment me. But the pain grew with each step, boots rubbing blisters that had formed during combat. Standard issue footwear, decent for short missions but clearly inadequate for extended wear after the fighting in sudden displacement. I tried to ignore it, focused on breathing, on managing the ink, on putting one foot in front of the other. Dane noticed anyway. His eyes flicked down to my unsteady gait, reading the situation with the same efficiency he brought to combat assessment.
Your boots.
It's fine. The automatic response, meaningless and transparent.
It's not fine, you're limping.
He scanned the desolate landscape, found what he was looking for. A weathered stump, some ancient tree reduced to sun-bleached wood by time and chaos.
Sit.
We should keep moving. The outpost.
Sit down, Liv.
His voice softened unexpectedly, the command becoming something almost gentle.
Let me help.
I hesitated, suddenly aware that this was different from scheduled transfers. This was just us, alone in the scarred territories. No instructors or protocol or witnesses.
Please.
Dane added. The words surprised me enough that I obeyed. I lowered myself onto the stump while he knelt before me with surprising grace for someone so large. His hands were steady as they reached for my boots, unlacing them with careful precision. He slid the first boot off, then the second, setting them aside. His fingers hooked into my socks, peeling them away to expose bare feet marked with red pressure points and forming blisters. The moment his hands touched my bare skin, the transfer accelerated. The sensation hit like a physical shock. His ash flooding into my system like winter moonlight, cold and clear and absolute. My ink draining into him like summer storms, wild and chaotic and free. I gasped softly, the sudden intensity overwhelming after weeks of inadequate mechanical transfers. Dane's hands began massaging my feet with practiced pressure. His thumbs worked into the arches, relieving tension I hadn't realized was building. His fingers kneaded the soreness from my heels, the stress from my toes, The transfer intensified with each deliberate touch. Skin-to-skin contact, creating a conduit far more efficient than clasped hands or mechanical kisses. The ink drained rapidly, black marks fading from my forearms. The volatile emotions stabilized, chaos finding balance in the order he provided. I felt his ash clearing in turn, the silver sheen diminishing as my chaos loosened his crystallization. The efficiency was staggering. Nothing like the sluggish transfers with Torin where my dissociation had slowed everything to a crawl. Nothing like the mechanical kisses that barely scratched the surface of what needed cleansing. This was what transfer was supposed to be. My earlier suspicions crystallized into certainty. The observation I had made weeks ago watching other students. The ones who felt something during contact transferred more efficiently. The ones who dissociated barely transferred at all. It wasn't just physical contact that mattered. It was intimacy. Real, felt, vulnerable connection. And Dane had known. "You knew this would work," I said, accusation sharpening my voice despite the surprise coloring it. Dane chuckled. The sound was low, dark, knowing. But it died quickly, replaced by something heavier. His hands didn't stop their work, but his expression turned distant. Almost melancholy.
Intimacy accelerates transfer.
He said quietly, his crystalline eyes fixed on my feet rather than my face.
The more contact, the faster the exchange. I learned that early.
There was weight in those words that made my chest tighten. History. Experience. Things he wasn't saying about how he had learned, who had taught him. What intimacy meant to someone planning to die young. I studied him in the afternoon light. The silver sheen dusting his dark hair. The faint translucence at the edges of his fingers. The too perfect stillness in his posture between movements. He looked like a man already halfway to becoming a monument. "Dane," I started carefully. "How long have you been... How much ash do you usually carry?" His hands stilled for just a moment before resuming the massage. When he spoke, his voice was matter-of-fact, resigned.
More than I should. I know what you're thinking. That I'm being reckless, that I'm accelerating my own crystallization.
He looked up at me then, and his eyes were ancient despite his 22 years.
You're right.
The confirmation settled like stones in still water.
I'm going to die young, Liv. We all are, but I'm going to make it count.
His hands continued their methodical work, grounding and distant simultaneously.
Sector 7 needs a silent watcher. One death saving thousands over decades. That's mathematics I can live with.
He paused, the ghost of a smile crossing his face.
Or die with.
The words landed with implications I didn't want to examine. This wasn't acceptance of mortality. This was active pursuit. Martyrdom dressed up as strategic efficiency. My throat tightened. That's not... You don't have to. But I didn't know how to finish that sentence. What could I say? That he was wrong to want meaning in his death? That his sacrifice wouldn't save lives? Both would be lies. The mathematics were sound. One glass man at Sector 7 could protect that section of wall for centuries, saving dozens of lives every year. The numbers added up. The logic was flawless, and it was still wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. What about wanting to live? The words came out as barely more than a whisper. Dane finished the massage, sliding my socks and boots back on with the same careful precision he had used to remove them. When he stood, offering his hand to help me up, his expression was carefully neutral again. Walls rebuilt, distance restored.
Wanting doesn't change what's necessary.
He said simply. The transfer was complete now. The clarity hit me like a physical shock. The ink had cleared to levels I hadn't experienced since my first day as a binder, before accumulation had become constant background noise. My mind felt crystalline, thoughts moving without the chaotic pressure that had been building for weeks. The volatile emotions that usually churned beneath the surface had settled into something approaching peace. My feet no longer hurt. The magic no longer threatened to fragment us. But more striking was the change in Dane. The silver sheen had vanished completely from his hair and skin. His fingers moved with fluid grace instead of the slight stiffness I had grown accustomed to seeing. The crystalline quality at the edges of his eyes had softened, making him look more human, more alive than I had ever seen him. He stood and stretched, his movements loose and natural, without the careful control he usually maintained to mask advancing crystallization. For a moment, he looked like what he must have been before the ash took hold. Young, vital, unburdened. Someone at the academy would notice this. The other instructors. His rotation partners. The change was too dramatic to miss, and questions would follow about how he had achieved such complete cleansing. Questions that would lead back to this moment. To intimacy neither of us could explain within the bounds of acceptable protocol. But something had shifted between us that had nothing to do with byproducts or transfers. I took his offered hand and stood. Our fingers lingered in contact longer than necessary before we both pulled away, suddenly awkward.
We should move.
Dane said, gesturing toward the horizon.
10 miles to the outpost. We can make it before dark if we maintain pace.
I nodded, not trusting my voice. We began walking. The walk to the outpost took 2 hours through terrain that felt haunted by its own history. Ruined farmhouses dotted the landscape. Their walls collapsed. Their roofs caved in from decades of neglect. Fields had gone to seed, wild grasses overtaking what had once been cultivated land. In the distance, a glass man stood frozen mid-stride. Some long-ago cleaver who had crystallized during the Reconquest Wars. We didn't speak. I wanted to ask a dozen questions about his death wish, about Sector 7, about whether he had ever considered that survival might matter more than sacrifice. But every time I opened my mouth, the words tangled in my throat. Dane's rigid posture didn't invite conversation. He walked slightly ahead, culmination across his back, his gait measured and controlled despite the chaos I knew was still settling in his system. The silence stretched between us, filled with things neither of us knew how to say. We passed more ruins, more glass men standing eternal watch over nothing. The scarred territories had been reclaimed from chaos decades ago. But the land still remembered what had been lost. I found myself watching Dane's back, the way he moved, the silver sheen that caught the fading light. He was planning to become one of those monuments, to stand frozen forever at Sector 7, conscious or not, watching the deadlands for eternity. The thought made my chest ache in ways I didn't want to examine. When we finally reached the outpost town, the sun was setting behind us, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The town was modest. A military garrison with supply depots and a transport hub. Functional architecture designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Guards at the gate checked our identification and waved us through without comment. Dane led me directly to the garrison commander's office, a squat building near the center of the compound. The commander was a weathered woman in her 50s, her uniform marked with service ribbons that suggested decades of combat experience.
Spatial displacement.
Dane reported, his voice clipped and professional.
We sealed a chaos manifestation approximately 100 miles west of here. The distortion threw us clear. Our team is likely still at the original site, wondering where we went.
The commander made notes on a crystal tablet, her expression suggesting this happened occasionally but not frequently.
I'll send word to the Academy. Next transport leaves at dawn. You'll bunk in the transit quarters tonight.
Thank you, Commander.
She dismissed us with a gesture, already moving to her next task. The transit quarters were exactly as comfortable as military efficiency allowed, which meant barely at all. A common room with hard benches, private sleeping cells barely large enough for a cot, shared facilities down the hall. The next transport wouldn't arrive until morning. We were stuck here for the night. Dane and I stood in the common room, suddenly uncertain. The mission was over. The crisis handled. We had no roles to play, no protocols to follow. Just awkwardness. I gestured vaguely toward the sleeping cells.
Yes, rest. Tomorrow will be...
Dane trailed off, not completing the thought. We stood there for another moment, the silence crystallizing into something almost painful. Thank you, I said finally. For the transfer, for helping.
It was necessary.
Still, thank you. He nodded once, sharp and final. Then he turned toward his own assigned cell, ending the conversation before it could become anything more. I retreated to my cell, closing the door with a soft click that echoed too loud in the small space. Sleep wouldn't come despite exhaustion. I lay on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the day in fragments. The chaos pocket rupturing. The perfect synchronization during the purge. The spatial displacement. His hands on my feet, intimate and careful and devastating. His voice saying, I'm going to die young, like it was already decided. Like there was no other option. I pulled out my journal from my pack, lit the single candle provided in the cell, and began to write. The words spilled out faster than my hand could move. First real mission. Chaos pocket that wasn't small. Fought creatures that shouldn't exist. Dane chose me for the convergence cast over more experienced binders. We synchronized perfectly. It felt right. Natural. Like my magic knew his. Spatial displacement threw us 100 miles. Severe ash and ink buildup. He massaged my feet to accelerate transfer. Skin contact works better than anything else. Why don't they teach us that? Why the mechanical kisses when touch is so much more efficient? Because intimacy can't be scheduled, can't be controlled, can't be made safe. He's planning to die at Sector 7, become a glass man, a silent watcher, one death saving thousands. The mathematics are perfect, the logic is flawless, and it's still wrong. He said wanting doesn't change what's necessary, like he's already accepted that he doesn't get to want things. Like survival is selfish when sacrifice is possible. How do I tell him he's already something more than a future monument? That dying young isn't noble if you're choosing it just to avoid living? I crossed out the last lines immediately. I had no right to that opinion. No claim on his choices, but the words lingered in my mind anyway, refusing to be erased by simple pen strokes. I blew out the candle and lay in darkness, listening to the sounds of the garrison settling for the night. Distant voices, footsteps, the hum of reality anchor fields maintaining order against encroaching chaos. My hands still remembered the feel of his touch, careful and precise and devastating in its gentleness. Tomorrow we would return to the academy. Back to protocols and schedules and the distance required by student and instructor roles. Back to pretending tonight hadn't changed anything, but something had cracked in the careful walls we both maintained. I just didn't know if that was dangerous or inevitable. Son. ## Dane. In his own cell across the compound, Dane stared at his hands. They still carried traces of her chaos. Still remembered the softness of her skin. The way her magic had synchronized with his, like they were two parts of one weapon. For years, he had known exactly how his story ended. Crystallized at Sector 7. Useful forever. Dead but purposeful. The mathematics were clean, the sacrifice meaningful.
Then this impossible girl looks at him with eyes that ask, "What about wanting to live?" And suddenly the math doesn't add up as cleanly as it used to.
He hated it.
Hated the way she made him question certainties he had accepted years ago. Hated the synchronization that felt too perfect, too natural, too much like partnership instead of rotation convenience. Hated that when he closed his eyes, he saw black oil traces on pale skin, chaos tempering order into something flexible enough to bend instead of break.
A future he had already promised to someone else's survival. He couldn't afford doubt. Couldn't afford wanting. The plan was set. Sector 7 needed a silent watcher. One death for thousands of lives. The numbers still worked. They had to work.
Because if they didn't, then everything he had been building toward was just elaborate suicide dressed up as purpose.
He rolled onto his side, seeking sleep that wouldn't come, and tried to forget the way her voice had broken when she whispered, "What about wanting to live?" It was easier to plan for death than hope for life.
She was ruining everything.